They found the door beneath the wet cobblestones, a handle slick with rust. Inside, the air was thick with arsenic and old blood. Teeth, hundreds of them, rolled across stone floors on their own, whispering names no one dared to speak aloud. Skulls grinned from shadowed shelves, empty sockets following every trembling step. And when they reached the chest at the heart of the vault, the teeth began to shift, aligning themselves to the shape of their own mouth. By the time they realized what had happened, it was already too late. The vault had claimed them, their very jaw becoming part of the collection that had been waiting, patient, for centuries. The night had fallen over London like a suffocating shroud, the damp fog pressing into every alley, every gaslit courtyard, until the city seemed to breathe only in whispers of wet stone and soot. Beneath the slick cobblestones of an unremarkable lane, a door hidden behind rusted hinges led downward, into a world untouched by the sun, untouched by time, and untouched by mercy. As it creaked open, a gust of stale air rose, thick with the iron taste of blood and the faint, acrid sting of arsenic, curling around the lungs like smoke and settling deep into the chest. The walls were lined with shelves so blackened by age they seemed carved from shadows themselves, each shelf crowded with human skulls, their empty sockets glinting in the dim, trembling light of a single swinging lantern. The faint reflection from the polished bone cast distorted faces into the darkness, faces that leered, half-formed and alive, as if memory itself had pressed into the marrow. Every step along the uneven stone floors reverberated through the vault, echoing against the damp walls, and with each echo came the low, almost musical scrape of metal against bone, the tools left behind by hands long rotted, arranging themselves in rhythms that were not the visitor's own. The air was a living thing, heavy with the odor of rot and enamel, of nerve fibers dried and brittle, carrying with it the faintest hum of centuries-old agony. The deeper one descended, the denser the air became, saturated with the weight of the collected teeth and jaws, each molar and incisor seeming to vibrate with memories of extraction, of screams muffled into rag-stuffed mouths, of apprentices punished and servants silenced, the metal taste of their suffering lingering in the tongue of the living as though the collection demanded acknowledgement. Lantern light flickered over tables polished by use, where scalpels, pliers, and delicate forceps lay as though waiting for the next hand to wield them, and shadows pooled beneath each tool, thickening into shapes that suggested movement, the faint sway of forms that were never alive, yet never entirely absent. From the walls, faint streaks of dried arsenic shimmered in the lantern glow, and the scent of its bitter tang mixed with the coppery taste of metal in the air, pressing against the teeth, the gums, the very palate, until the mouth itself felt a repository of histories not its own. Somewhere beyond the first rows of shelves, a drawer trembled open, spilling teeth across the floor, tiny white crescents that rolled and clinked, murmuring against the stone as if to announce each life they had once belonged to, each jawbone a ledger of betrayal and pain. The shadows of the skulls seemed to lean toward the intruder, their grins widening with impossible intent, and the soft groan of stones settling beneath centuries of weight punctuated the faint, metallic whispers that filled the chamber. Every breath drew in a mixture of dust and decay, a second heartbeat of the vault itself, embedding into sinews and marrow the memory of every extraction, every scream, every secret sealed in the darkness. The silence between sounds was itself a presence, dense and deliberate, pressing against eardrums and spine alike, and as the visitor moved, the air seemed to thicken, bending the light of the lantern into impossible angles, casting skeletal shadows that stretched and writhed like living things. In that suffocating darkness, where every surface had absorbed suffering and every shelf groaned under the weight of uncounted teeth, it became impossible to separate the living from the dead. The smell of metal, the tang of arsenic, the whispering scrape of unseen instruments pressed in from all sides, threading through the body, leaving the taste of centuries upon the tongue, and with every heartbeat, the skulls seemed to grin wider, their hollow eyes reflecting not light, but the inevitable recognition that the visitor was no longer merely present, but already accounted for in the ledger of pain they had curated through lifetimes of extraction and silence. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with memory, an unyielding rhythm that had been building for centuries, vibrating through the plaster and stone, through the grime-slick floors, and into the very marrow of anyone who dared to descend into the vault. Layers upon layers of lime-streaked plaster had absorbed every sound, every movement, every whispered secret of torment that had occurred within these subterranean chambers. The faint thud of hammers striking bone, the subtle drip of extracted molars landing in wooden trays, the quiet snapping of nerves severed and left behind. Each sound had etched itself into the walls, creating a resonance that hummed almost imperceptibly beneath the soles of the feet. There was a cadence here, a rhythm older than memory, and it wound itself around the visitor, curling into sinews and tendons, pressing into joints with a patience that was deliberate, surgical, inexorable. Every jawbone on the shelves told a story that was impossible to ignore. They were not mere bones. They were witnesses, participants, silent judges, each one carrying the weight of betrayal and malice. Servants silenced for the crime of curiosity, their teeth extracted not for hygiene, but as tokens of obedience. Children stolen from the streets for reasons never recorded in ink, their molars filed into shapes that made them appear almost human, almost alive, staring from the shelves with hollow, accusing eyes. Apprentices punished for clumsiness, their growing teeth chipped, filed, or burned as an example, leaving behind histories that even death could not erase. Every shelf leaned toward the visitor with subtle insistence, as if the very weight of memory compelled acknowledgement, and the rows of skulls, some cracked, some polished smooth with age and handling, grinned with a patience that was eternal, knowing, and inexorably attentive. The lantern light flickered, casting elongated, impossible shadows that intertwined with the skulls, the instruments, the walls themselves, creating forms that were not entirely the absence of light, but not entirely corporeal either. Scalpels gleamed with a fresh, unnatural sheen, their edges reflecting a light that seemed to pulse in time with the walls, and the pliers, their metal twisted with age, emitted a soft, resonant groan when touched by air currents, a sound like a whisper from the long-dead hands that had wielded them. The visitor could feel the instruments before seeing them, a subtle vibration in the fingertips, a ghostly warmth in the air, as if the metal retained the memory of countless extractions, countless acts of precision and cruelty performed in the dim candlelight of a century-long obsession. The air carried a hum that was musical, or almost musical, not in the sense of harmony, but in the sense of vibration, a low, undulating resonance that threaded through walls, floors, and ceilings alike, threading itself into the marrow of those who moved within its grasp. It was as though the bones themselves sighed, not in relief, not in pain, but in the utter inevitability of remembrance, each exhale an echo of hundreds of years of extraction, punishment, and the quiet enjoyment of discipline carried out with meticulous care. Between the shelves, the darkness was thick enough to feel, carrying with it a taste of metal and decay that clung to the tongue, coating it with a faint bitterness that was both repulsive and seductive. Every inhalation drew not only air but memory, and the visitor could almost feel the nerves of those who had come before threading through sinews, leaving a subtle imprint of fear, compliance, and pain. The floor beneath was cold, stone smooth and slick with centuries of absorbed fluids, and every step was accompanied by the faint echo of footsteps that did not belong to the visitor, faint impressions of those who had walked these paths in life and in death, their presence lingering like the metallic scent of dried blood. A drawer opened of its own accord, and a handful of molars rolled across the stone floor, the tiny white crescents clicking like the soft applause of unseen witnesses, a sound both intimate and accusatory, and for a moment, the visitor could have sworn the teeth formed letters in their path, spelling out the names of the dead and the crimes committed in these subterranean halls. Lantern light caught the edges of the jaws stacked meticulously along the shelves, revealing cracks and chips that were not merely the passage of time, but records, deliberate annotations of suffering, each notch a punishment, each fracture a warning. There were no cobwebs, no dust to obscure the shelves, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean by centuries of attention, of care, of devotion to the collection. The instruments on tables seemed to shift in subtle arcs when the visitor's shadow passed, aligning themselves as if anticipating use, as if the collection demanded participation, required recognition, and the visitor felt the pull in every joint, every tendon, a subtle insistence that compliance, or at least acknowledgement, was not optional. Shadows pooled beneath tables and shelves, curling along the floors, forming shapes that suggested limbs, fingers, mouths, eyes, half-formed echoes of past torment that flickered in the corner of vision, always present, yet always just beyond grasp. Every inhale carried more than scent. It carried accusation, memory, and the weight of 100 generations of pain. The walls themselves seemed to breathe in time with the visitor's pulse, expanding subtly, contracting almost imperceptibly, embedding themselves into muscle and bone, threading the living into the ledger of extraction and silence that had been recorded long before the first candle flickered in this vault. The metallic tang of blood and decay-coated lips, teeth, and tongue, and the hum of the tools, the thud of invisible hammers, the whisper of teeth on stone, threaded into every nerve ending, bending perception, stretching time, making the chamber a living archive, a cathedral of pain, a vault in which history refused to remain dead. The skulls seemed to lean closer, their hollow eyes reflecting lantern light into shapes that writhed and twisted, pulling at the corners of vision, tugging at memory, dragging the visitor's awareness along a subtle, inexorable current of centuries-old observation. The instruments emitted soft, insistent groans, responding to unseen hands. The floorboards resonated with the imprint of past steps, and the teeth scattered across the floor clicked and rolled, murmuring in a language of anguish and inevitability. There was no way to separate the living from the dead. The scent, the sound, the metallic taste in the mouth, the pressure in the joints, the vibration threading through bones, all insisted upon a singular truth. The vault was not a repository merely of objects. It was a living memory, a conscience in stone and bone, and the visitor could feel themselves being inscribed into its ledger, every pulse, every breath, every subtle shiver accounted for, woven into the narrative of extraction, obedience, and the quiet, meticulous cruelty that had defined these subterranean halls for generations. The air thickened with the subtle insistence of recognition, and with each heartbeat the walls seemed to sigh. The teeth on shelves gleamed with new awareness, and the instruments trembled in anticipation of the next motion, the next gesture, the next act in a cycle that would endure long after the visitor left, or ceased to exist entirely. The staircase spiraled downward into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself, and with each step the air thickened, carrying a scent that was at once cloying and corrosive, a nearly sweet perfume of decay that clung to hair and clothing, pressing into nostrils and lungs with insistent insistence. The stone walls, slick with moisture and age, seemed to absorb the lantern light, swallowing shadows whole while reflecting impossible shapes back onto the visitor, shapes that hinted at movement, at watching, at patience far older than memory. The shelves multiplied, narrowing the path until the visitor walked between towers of jawbones, stacked with meticulous care, each mandible resting upon another like trophies of submission, while half-rotted masks leaned from adjacent ledges, their painted eyes chipped and blank, staring with an expression of silent accusation that defied the living to breathe without feeling the weight of judgment. Somewhere in the murk, a drawer trembled and slid open, expelling a handful of teeth onto the stone floor, each one rolling and clicking against its neighbor as if in conversation, tiny marbles imbued with centuries of pain, humming faintly with a resonance that pricked the nerves and set the tongue to quivering, leaving a metallic tang that flooded the mouth with the ghosts of fillings, rotten enamel, and old blood. The instruments on nearby tables quivered with life unseen, scalpels and pliers arranging themselves with a deliberate rhythm, scraping softly against the edges of trays, vibrating in anticipation of hands that would never come, their ritual of devotion ongoing, unbroken, infinite. Lantern light caught on the edges of metal, throwing long, warped reflections across the walls and floor, revealing subtle scratches in the stone, faint depressions in the shelves, the evidence of movement by entities long dead, entities whose attention was immediate, patient, and insatiable. The visitor's heartbeat began to echo the rhythm of the instruments, a low thrum that threaded through the ankles, the knees, the spine, curling into the collarbones and across the sternum, until it felt as though the body had become another table in the collection, another surface upon which memory and pain might be traced. Each jawbone leaned imperceptibly toward the intruder, the grins widening as if sensing the presence of flesh that could still feel, still breathe, still yield to the pressure of centuries of meticulous observation. The air carried the subtle scrape of unseen fingers across wood, metal, and bone, a friction that whispered of discipline, of punishment, of lessons learned in terror and silence. Somewhere behind a stack of skulls, a shadow stirred, stretching along the wall in shapes that were not quite human, not quite absent, curling toward the visitor with a patient insistence that pressed against skin and sinew, threading into the muscles until every twitch, every minor contraction, every reflexive shiver was already recorded, already accounted for in the ledger of the subterranean vault. The metallic taste of blood and enamel intensified with every step, a flood of past extractions, of teeth pulled before their time, of cries smothered in rags or muffled by clenched hands, and the faint hum of nerves severed centuries ago thrummed through the air like the pulse of a living organism. A pair of pliers twitched as if lifted by invisible hands, its polished edges catching the flicker of lantern light and throwing ghostly sparks onto nearby jawbones, their empty sockets reflecting the movement with an uncanny intelligence, the sense that they were not merely skulls but sentinels, custodians of memory, conduits of the pain embedded in every crevice of the vault. The visitor's breath came in shallow gasps as the shadows multiplied, stretching along the shelves, merging with the damp walls, pooling around feet, tracing invisible lines along ankles and calves, insinuating themselves into the rhythm of the body until it became impossible to discern where the flesh ended and the history began. From somewhere deeper within the darkness, a drawer opened again, spilling more teeth across the floor in a small avalanche, and the soft clinking became a chorus, a cacophony of enamel and bone that pressed against the eardrums, vibrating through vertebrae and ribs, mapping itself onto the visitor's own skeleton with deliberate precision. Lanterns flickered as if in response, throwing prisms of light into corners that seemed to stretch and bend impossibly, creating the illusion of corridors beyond corridors, aisles of jaws and teeth that extended into infinity, each filled with the whispers of past torment, the quiet insistence that no movement went unrecorded, no hesitation unnoticed, no fear unrewarded or unpunished. The walls exhaled faintly, releasing a breath heavy with the scent of decay and arsenic, embedding itself in hair, clothing, and skin, layering over the metallic tang that already filled the mouth, until the visitor could taste the memories of hundreds of extracted teeth, hundreds of quiet deaths, hundreds of lessons administered with unwavering devotion to the collection. The floor beneath seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the vault itself, stone and mortar shifting subtly, resonating in perfect synchrony with the metallic hum of instruments and the whispers of teeth on stone, and every movement was met with pressure, a subtle insistence that forced acknowledgement, an unspoken agreement that the visitor had stepped beyond mere curiosity and into participation. Shadows pressed closer, wrapping around the legs, coiling like cold serpents across calves and ankles, brushing against the fabric of clothing, seeping beneath shoes and along stockings, following tendons and sinews until muscles contracted involuntarily in response to movements that were not their own. The masks on the shelves tilted ever so slightly, eyes glinting with chipped paint that now seemed to shimmer with life, watching, noting, remembering, marking every hesitation. The lantern trembled in its chain, casting fractured light across floors slick with damp and dusted with centuries of enamel dust, illuminating the sheen on pliers and scalpels, highlighting every crack in jawbones, every imperfection on teeth that had been meticulously filed or broken, emphasizing the human attention that had preserved them with care so obsessive it transcended morality. A faint wind whispered from the stairwell above, carrying the scent of wet London streets, a reminder of the world outside, but it was distant, muted, swallowed by the dense atmosphere of the vault, the pulse of teeth and bones, metal and shadow, memory and extraction. Every nerve ending hummed with awareness, every tendon a conduit of unseen pressure, until the visitor's own jaw felt tight, the tongue heavy with metallic taste, the teeth aching as if aware of the presence of the collection, as if their own enamel had absorbed centuries of pain and obedience. Somewhere deeper, below the spiral of stairs and the shelves stacked impossibly high with mandibles and masks, the instruments aligned themselves once more, and the shadows pressed closer, coiling along the floor and walls with patient, deliberate intent, whispering, scraping, humming, until the visitor felt not merely observed, but accounted for, threaded into the ledger of the vault, inscribed among the teeth and jaws and instruments in a record that would endure long after breath ceased, long after the lantern went out, long after the stairs and shelves and shadows had been forgotten by the world above. Time bent and twisted in the subterranean vault, stretching minutes into hours, hours into decades, while seconds collapsed into themselves with the silent insistence of centuries-old machinery. The stone floors, slick with moisture and the remnants of enamel dust, seemed to inhale and exhale underfoot, subtle expansions and contractions that mirrored the memory of victims whose bodies had never seen proper burial, whose cries had been absorbed into the very foundation of the vault. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along walls and shelves, weaving between stacks of jawbones, curling into sockets, slipping across fractured teeth, and the visitor felt their own jaw tighten and twitch involuntarily, a suggestion of replacement, a ghostly reminder that the collection was not merely passive, but an organism that required flesh to complete its ledger. Lanterns quivered in their chains, throwing flickering light onto walls that were slick with centuries of condensation and subtle decay, illuminating corners where instruments rested with gleaming anticipation, scalpels, pliers, and drills aligned as if awaiting hands that would never come, yet remained obedient to a memory older than the living. The chair in the center of the room drew the eye with impossible magnetism, a polished throne of leather and iron cuffs, stained with saliva, blood, and terror collected over decades, the surface unervingly smooth, every groove, crease, and nick telling a story of compliance, pain, and ritualized extraction. The air itself thickened until it pressed into the lungs and throat, a nearly tangible presence, carrying the metallic tang of old fillings, the bitter iron of blood long dried, the acrid scent of arsenic that had seeped into every crevice, saturating each inhalation with a sense of inevitability. Every step along the stone floor was echoed by a faint vibration, a hum threading into the ankles, knees, spine, coiling upward into the collarbones, threading sinews and tendons, insinuating itself into the rhythm of the heart until every pulse was shared with the vault, aligned with the slow, patient cadence of the instruments and the teeth and bones stacked in meticulous arrays along every shelf. The shadows moved with deliberate grace, pooling and stretching over skulls that leaned imperceptibly toward the visitor, their hollow sockets reflecting lantern light in patterns that were not entirely random, conveying subtle, accusatory messages that pressed into the mind and nerve endings simultaneously. Somewhere beneath a shelf, a drawer opened of its own accord, spilling teeth onto the floor, hundreds of them clicking and rolling across stone like a private percussion ensemble of anguish and memory, each enamel crescent vibrating with histories of extraction, of screams muffled by cloth or hand, of nerves severed in quiet devotion to the collection. The visitor could taste these histories, the metallic tang blooming across the tongue, filling the mouth with the ghosts of every extraction ever performed, the subtle ache of centuries-old pain threading through the jaw and cheekbones as though the bones themselves remembered and demanded acknowledgement. Instruments twitched and rearranged themselves as if directed by invisible hands, pliers aligning with scalpel edges, drills rotating subtly on tables slick with condensation, an unbroken ritual of preparation that did not require living hands to continue. Shadows pressed closer to the legs, curling around ankles, climbing slowly along stockings and trousers, insinuating themselves beneath shoes, threading invisible tendons and pulling at muscles in small, precise contractions, each twitch a measured response to the history that filled the vault, each shiver a private acknowledgement of the centuries of discipline recorded in enamel and bone. The air vibrated with a low hum that was almost musical, not in harmony but in cadence, a rhythm that resonated with the marrow of every bone in the room, threading into the visitor's own skeleton, bending sinew and tendon into reluctant compliance. Every jawbone seemed to lean further, grins widening, hollow sockets reflecting not only the lantern light, but the subtle vibrations of unbroken observation, a patient, endless attention that bore into nerve endings and memory alike. The chair of leather cuffs seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in tandem with the air, with the pulse of teeth on shelves, with the subtle movement of shadows curling across the floors, an unspoken insistence that presence was acknowledgement, that the visitor was now part of the ledger of extraction and compliance, that every shiver, every heartbeat, every forced contraction of muscle was noted, recorded, threaded into the endless archive that would endure long after the lantern dimmed or the visitor ceased to exist. The floorboards moaned with barely audible groans, responding to weight, movement, and pulse, echoing back as subtle pressure in knees and ankles, a tactile recording of participation, a subtle insistence that history was not merely observed but inhabited, coiled through sinew and marrow like a living manuscript of cruelty and devotion. Lantern light fractured across walls and ceilings, illuminating shelves stacked impossibly high with mandibles and skulls, masks and trays, and the instruments glinting with patient anticipation, highlighting minute imperfections that were not random but annotations, deliberate inscriptions of lessons learned and obedience exacted over decades, centuries. The air was so thick it clung to skin, clothing, and hair, a semi-solid mixture of dust, moisture, metallic tang, and faintly sweet decay, embedding itself into pores and fibers, leaving the visitor's body as much a part of the vault as the shelves, the instruments, the teeth, and jawbones themselves. Every breath drew the presence of the dead into the lungs, a communion of pain, compliance, and memory that threaded through every organ, every fiber of muscle, until the visitor could no longer distinguish self from archive, breath from whisper, pulse from the unbroken rhythm of the collection. The shadows stretched further, pressed closer, and the low, insistent hum threaded into every nerve ending, coiling around sinew, bending joints subtly, insisting upon recognition, compliance, participation. The visitor's own tongue bore the taste of every extracted tooth, every severed nerve, every muffled scream, as though the mouth itself had become a vessel of memory, a conduit for centuries of extraction and devotion. The lantern flickered violently, casting fractured light across walls and floors slick with moisture, illuminating shadows that leaned, twisted, pressed, and withdrew only to press again, until the vault itself seemed alive, its pulse inseparable from the heartbeat of the visitor, its breath, its insistence, embedding a truth that could not be denied. Here, in the underworld of the dentists, time was subordinate to the collection, to memory, to the teeth and bones and instruments that had lived far longer than the fleeting seconds of the living. And those who entered were no longer merely observers. They were accounted for, threaded into the ledger of the vault, marked by shadows, metal, and bone in a record that would endure long after the world above had forgotten that the stairs had ever existed. The descent pressed onward, each step heavier than the last, as though the vault itself resisted intrusion, stretching stone and shadow into an infinite spiral of darkness. Teeth whispered continuously, rattling in drawers, scraping against each other in hollow conversation, humming faintly along the shelves where jawbones leaned impossibly toward one another, their empty sockets watching, recording, judging. Each molar, each cusp, each incisor seemed to thrum with memory, and the visitor's hands twitched, compelled to reach out, to trace the worn grooves, to count and measure and confirm existence, as if the act itself could anchor them to sanity. The air grew thicker with the scent of arsenic, acrid and sharp, biting nostrils, clawing at the eyes, leaving a residue on the tongue that drowned out every memory of the streets above, the gaslit lamps, the rain-slicked cobblestones. Shadows pooled beneath the shelves and behind stacks of skulls, shifting and elongating, stretching along the damp walls like fingers reaching from a hidden intelligence, and the visitor felt every step accompanied by pressure, subtle but unrelenting, pressing into calves, knees, spine, curling into the sinews with patient insistence. Lanterns swung gently, though no air moved, throwing fractured prisms across instruments aligned with ritualistic precision, scalpels shivering, pliers arranged in perfect rows, drills lying in readiness, as if anticipating hands that would never arrive, yet carrying a will of their own, a devotion to extraction that transcended the living. The floorboards groaned with the memory of centuries, each plank flexing and contracting beneath the weight of footsteps, a breathless rhythm that threaded through the ankles, up legs, into the collarbones, aligning with the pulse of teeth, bone, and shadow until muscle and marrow quivered in tacit recognition. From the depths of a shelf, a drawer shifted violently, spilling dozens of teeth across the floor, tiny white crescents clattering like a ghostly orchestra, bouncing against stone and each other in patterns that defied reason, resonating through the marrow of the visitor's own body. The metallic taste of enamel and blood surged across the tongue, the sharp tang of old fillings, of nerves severed and dried centuries before, igniting a low, insistent ache in the jaw, threading down the throat and into the chest, embedding memory into the very act of breathing. Skeletal faces in the shadows seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally as lantern light fractured across their hollow eyes, their grins widening beyond human proportion, revealing the patience and intelligence of a collection that had grown sentient over decades of obsessive care. Instruments moved subtly, aligning with impossible precision, their edges glinting as if freshly polished, reflecting light that was not there, bending shadows across the walls in complex, unreadable scripts of pain and obedience. The chair at the room's center remained a magnet of dread, polished leather and iron cuffs glinting faintly with the residue of centuries, its surface slick with saliva, blood, and fear, seeming to inhale and exhale with the same rhythm as the floor and shelves, calling silently for the visitor to comply, to submit, to take their place among the observed. Shadows stretched closer, pressing along the ankles and calves, curling beneath stockings and trousers, insinuating themselves into tendons and sinew, forcing involuntary contractions, small tremors that mirrored centuries of discipline encoded into enamel and bone. The hum of the vault was nearly musical, a cadence threading through stone, instruments, teeth, and bone, pulsing in tandem with the visitor's own heartbeat until every pulse felt borrowed, every breath a communion with memory and extraction, every nerve a witness to the ledger of pain meticulously maintained over decades. Lanterns flickered violently, casting prisms into corners where the shadows thickened, merging with damp walls and shelves stacked impossibly high, highlighting imperfections in skulls and jawbones, fissures in enamel, deliberate chips and markings that spoke of careful study, of punishment, of rituals performed for observation rather than mercy. The teeth themselves seemed to murmur, each tiny cusp a syllable, each molar a phrase, telling tales of servants silenced for curiosity, apprentices punished for errors, children taken from streets to satisfy obsession, all narratives threading into the air with a metallic tang that coated tongue and throat. The visitor's hands twitched with compulsion, tracing invisible lines along bone, following the curves of mandibles, feeling the subtle vibrations of nerves that no longer existed, registering the centuries of devotion embedded in each object. From somewhere deeper, a drawer opened again, releasing another avalanche of teeth that rolled and clicked across the floorboards, their chorus layering over the hum of the vault, threading into the vibrations of metal instruments, the pulse of the air, the insistent rhythm of shadows pressing closer. The chair seemed to pulse in response, the leather tightening and expanding subtly, iron cuffs shifting as though anticipating compliance, and the visitor could not move without the sensation of every tendon and muscle being measured, every shiver accounted for, every heartbeat synchronized with the ancient cadence of extraction and observation. Shadows pressed ever closer, curling along the floors, climbing along legs, brushing against clothing, insinuating themselves into every fiber until muscle and marrow obeyed the unseen rhythm of the vault, until body and history became inseparable. Lanterns flickered once more, illuminating instruments and bone, shelves and masks, revealing the obsessive care that had preserved each object, each fragment of memory, as if the collection demanded acknowledgement, as if it were alive with centuries of patience and will. The metallic taste in the mouth surged, stronger, sharper, a flood of enamel, fillings, blood, arsenic, and memory, a reminder that the visitor had crossed into a realm where observation and participation were inseparable, where the teeth themselves whispered not only history but expectation, demanding attention, compliance, and recognition. The skeletal faces leaned impossibly close, grins widening in anticipation, hollow eyes glinting with impossible intelligence, and the instruments shivered in alignment as the shadows coiled, a web of meticulous insistence that threaded the visitor's very being into the collection. Each step, each breath, each twitch of muscle was recorded, inscribed into the ledger of teeth and bone, until the visitor could no longer discern where the living ended and the vault began, until every nerve, every sinew, every pulse had been accounted for in the unbroken, eternal ritual of observation and extraction that had persisted long before their arrival, and would continue long after they had been forgotten above ground. The descent pressed onward, each step heavier than the last, as though the vault itself resisted intrusion, stretching stone and shadow into an infinite spiral of darkness. Teeth whispered continuously, rattling in drawers, scraping against each other in hollow conversation, humming faintly along the shelves where jawbones leaned impossibly toward one another, their empty sockets watching, recording, judging. Each molar, each cusp, each incisor seemed to thrum with memory, and the visitor's hands twitched, compelled to reach out, to trace the worn grooves, to count and measure and confirm existence, as if the act itself could anchor them to sanity. The air grew thicker with the scent of arsenic, acrid and sharp, biting nostrils, clawing at the eyes, leaving a residue on the tongue that drowned out every memory of the streets above, the gaslit lamps, the rain-slicked cobblestones. Shadows pooled beneath the shelves and behind stacks of skulls, shifting and elongating, stretching along the damp walls like fingers reaching from a hidden intelligence, and the visitor felt every step accompanied by pressure, subtle but unrelenting, pressing into calves, knees, spine, curling into the sinews with patient insistence. Lanterns swung gently, though no air moved, throwing fractured prisms across instruments aligned with ritualistic precision, scalpels shivering, pliers arranged in perfect rows, drills lying in readiness, as if anticipating hands that would never arrive, yet carrying a will of their own, a devotion to extraction that transcended the living. The floorboards groaned with the memory of centuries, each plank flexing and contracting beneath the weight of footsteps, a breathless rhythm that threaded through the ankles, up legs, into the collarbones, aligning with the pulse of teeth, bone, and shadow until muscle and marrow quivered in tacit recognition. From the depths of a shelf, a drawer shifted violently, spilling dozens of teeth across the floor, tiny white crescents clattering like a ghostly orchestra, bouncing against stone and each other in patterns that defied reason, resonating through the marrow of the visitor's own body. The metallic taste of enamel and blood surged across the tongue, the sharp tang of old fillings, of nerves severed and dried centuries before, igniting a low, insistent ache in the jaw, threading down the throat and into the chest, embedding memory into the very act of breathing. Skeletal faces in the shadows seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally as lantern light fractured across their hollow eyes, their grins widening beyond human proportion, revealing the patience and intelligence of a collection that had grown sentient over decades of obsessive care. Instruments moved subtly, aligning with impossible precision, their edges glinting as if freshly polished, reflecting light that was not there, bending shadows across the walls in complex, unreadable scripts of pain and obedience. The chair at the room's center remained a magnet of dread, polished leather and iron cuffs glinting faintly with the residue of centuries, its surface slick with saliva, blood, and fear, seeming to inhale and exhale with the same rhythm as the floor and shelves, calling silently for the visitor to comply, to submit, to take their place among the observed. Shadows stretched closer, pressing along the ankles and calves, curling beneath stockings and trousers, insinuating themselves into tendons and sinew, forcing involuntary contractions, small tremors that mirrored centuries of discipline encoded into enamel and bone. The hum of the vault was nearly musical, a cadence threading through stone, instruments, teeth, and bone, pulsing in tandem with the visitor's own heartbeat until every pulse felt borrowed, every breath a communion with memory and extraction, every nerve a witness to the ledger of pain meticulously maintained over decades. Lanterns flickered violently, casting prisms into corners where the shadows thickened, merging with damp walls and shelves stacked impossibly high, highlighting imperfections in skulls and jawbones, fissures in enamel, deliberate chips and markings that spoke of careful study, of punishment, of rituals performed for observation rather than mercy. The teeth themselves seemed to murmur, each tiny cusp a syllable, each molar a phrase, telling tales of servants silenced for curiosity, apprentices punished for errors, children taken from streets to satisfy obsession, all narratives threading into the air with a metallic tang that coated tongue and throat. The visitor's hands twitched with compulsion, tracing invisible lines along bone, following the curves of mandibles, feeling the subtle vibrations of nerves that no longer existed, registering the centuries of devotion embedded in each object. From somewhere deeper, a drawer opened again, releasing another avalanche of teeth that rolled and clicked across the floorboards, their chorus layering over the hum of the vault, threading into the vibrations of metal instruments, the pulse of the air, the insistent rhythm of shadows pressing closer. The chair seemed to pulse in response, the leather tightening and expanding subtly, iron cuffs shifting as though anticipating compliance, and the visitor could not move without the sensation of every tendon and muscle being measured, every shiver accounted for, every heartbeat synchronized with the ancient cadence of extraction and observation. Shadows pressed ever closer, curling along the floors, climbing along legs, brushing against clothing, insinuating themselves into every fiber until muscle and marrow obeyed the unseen rhythm of the vault, until body and history became inseparable. Lanterns flickered once more, illuminating instruments and bone, shelves and masks, revealing the obsessive care that had preserved each object, each fragment of memory, as if the collection demanded acknowledgement, as if it were alive with centuries of patience and will. The metallic taste in the mouth surged, stronger, sharper, a flood of enamel, fillings, blood, arsenic, and memory, a reminder that the visitor had crossed into a realm where observation and participation were inseparable, where the teeth themselves whispered not only history but expectation, demanding attention, compliance, and recognition. The skeletal faces leaned impossibly close, grins widening in anticipation, hollow eyes glinting with impossible intelligence, and the instruments shivered in alignment as the shadows coiled, a web of meticulous insistence that threaded the visitor's very being into the collection. Each step, each breath, each twitch of muscle was recorded, inscribed into the ledger of teeth and bone, until the visitor could no longer discern where the living ended and the vault began, until every nerve, every sinew, every pulse had been accounted for in the unbroken, eternal ritual of observation and extraction that had persisted long before their arrival, and would continue long after they had been forgotten above ground. The final chamber yawned like a maw beneath centuries of stone, a space where shadows pooled thick as blood, and the air shimmered with a heat that clung to skin, pressing into lungs with every inhalation. The scent of arsenic, iron, and decayed enamel was almost unbearable, a weight that settled in the throat and mixed with the metallic tang on the tongue, spreading into every corner of the mouth until memory itself seemed coated in rust and rot. The lantern's glow revealed a massive chest, carved from dark oak and polished smooth by hands long turned to dust, its lid thrown open as though an invitation or accusation. Teeth poured from its interior like a river of shadowed ivory, clattering across the stone floor with a hollow resonance that filled the room and threaded into the marrow, echoing centuries of extraction, suffering, and obsession. Skull eyes glimmered from their shelves along the walls, sockets catching the light like twin flames, their grins widening with impossible anticipation, as if the bones themselves recognized the trespasser, acknowledging the presence of one who had finally reached the heart of the collection. The visitor knelt, drawn to the cascade of teeth, fingers trembling as they reached out, compelled to gather a handful, yet hesitation burned in their chest, a primal sense that what was held in the hand could never be released unchanged. The moment the first tooth touched skin, an eruption of sensation surged through the mouth, jaw, and throat, a violent, intimate recognition, as the teeth began to shift and twist, reshaping themselves into the very contours of the visitor's own mouth. Pain flared sharply, nerve endings screaming as the mandible creaked and stretched, forcing unfamiliar alignments, grinding enamel against enamel in a resonance that was both internal and eternal. Each movement of the jaw sounded like metal striking stone, reverberating through the vault, and each bite, each snap, each shift seemed to write itself into the very structure of the chamber, as though the building exhaled in response, pulsing with satisfaction and hunger. The visitor's hands clutched at the floor, at skulls, at instruments lined along tables with unholy precision, but the pressure of the chamber pressed insistently on every joint, every sinew, aligning pulse with pulse, heartbeat with heartbeat, until the body was no longer solely its own. Shadows pressed closer, weaving between shelves and instruments, pooling beneath knees and climbing along trousers and stockings, wrapping the living in a rhythm dictated by centuries of obsession, every nerve bending involuntarily to the will of the vault. The lantern trembled, casting fractured prisms across jawbones and skulls, revealing intricate cracks, deliberate chips, and polished grooves where hands long gone had studied, punished, preserved, all of it feeding into the pulse that now threaded through the visitor's own enamel, filling every hollow with a memory of pain and compliance. The air grew thick, almost liquid, pressing into the mouth, nostrils, and ears, carrying the faint hum of distant instruments, the subtle scrape of pliers, the whisper of drills, moving as if guided by invisible hands, aligning with the new teeth, the reshaped jaw, the living presence inscribed into the collection. Panic clawed upward, but it was futile. Every breath drew in metallic tang, arsenic, decay, and memory, embedding history into sinew and marrow, a ritual impossible to resist. The visitor felt the eyes of the skulls, the teeth in the chest, the instruments, and the shadows threading into every thought, every pulse, every trembling muscle, until self-awareness became a thin, brittle layer over a body already claimed. The teeth inside the mouth pressed and ground as if alive, each cusp and molar a vessel of centuries, a record of every extraction, every whispered threat, every silent scream preserved in bone and enamel. The jaw opened of its own accord, snapping shut, twisting, aligning with rhythms older than any living memory, and the metallic taste swelled until it coated tongue and teeth, filling the mouth with the essence of the collection itself. Lantern light danced across the chest, across rows of jawbones stacked with obsessive precision, highlighting gaps where teeth had been taken, added, replaced, as though the collection was learning, adapting, claiming more than observation, demanding a permanent, physical submission. A sudden chill swept through the chamber, a breath of frozen air that sank into every sinew, making joints ache and muscles spasm involuntarily, pressing into the spine with subtle insistence, as though the very vault exhaled the final act of its will. The visitor's hands clutched the knees, the floor, the nearest skull, yet resistance dissolved under the pressure of centuries, under the weight of observation, under the persistent pulse threading through enamel and bone. Every attempt to speak, to call for mercy, was swallowed by the thick, metallic air, absorbed into the murmuring teeth that lined the chest and shelves, into the instruments that glimmered with unholy patience, into the shadows that twisted with purpose, into the very walls that pulsed with the memory of extraction and obedience. And then, with a final, almost imperceptible twist of the mandible, the visitor understood fully. They were no longer merely a witness, a trespasser, a living observer. Every bite, every shift of the jaw, every metallic taste, every tremor of muscle, every nerve had been claimed. They had become part of the collection, a living tooth among the dead, inscribed forever into the ledger of the Victorian dentists who had long since ceased asking for consent. The teeth hummed with satisfaction, instruments aligned in silent applause, shadows coiled tightly, and the vault exhaled once more, a breath that pressed into lungs, spine, and skull, embedding memory and ownership into every fiber. The visitor's reflection, glimpsed for a moment in a polished skull, revealed a face transformed, the mouth filled with unfamiliar teeth that ground relentlessly, a living testament to centuries of obsession. And in that instant, the vault spoke through the resonance of enamel and bone, whispering its verdict. There would be no exit, no relief, no forgetting. Only the eternal communion of the living with the teeth of the dead, a permanent inscription in the unending ledger of pain and devotion.